My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. That was, at one point in time, a common schoolyard rhyme in the same vein as Ring Around the Rosie, a rhyme that was repeated by children across the country for decades. Yet, unlike Ring Around the Rosie, which scholars don't seem to believe actually had anything to do with the Black Death despite the popular myth claiming otherwise, the Lizzie Borden rhyme does have a very real and very bloody historical origin. That being said, it's not exactly accurate. The woman slain in the Borden home, for example, was not Lizzie's birth mother, but instead her stepmother. And while both individuals were brutally and repeatedly struck with a hatchet, not an axe, neither received quite as many blows as the rhyme suggests. That being said, this was still a particularly brutal crime, which is part of the reason behind its fame, as Lizzie Borden's stepmother and father received 19 and 10 blows respectively. Additionally, while the rhyme takes the position that Lizzie was the murderer, officially she was found not guilty. As such, the crime is technically unsolved, which has led to numerous theories being produced over the years as to who the real culprit was. Indeed, there are a dizzying array of books produced by author after author who claim to have discovered the real truth or the final answer as they present their case for who was really responsible. In many ways, then, the Lizzie Borden case is very much akin to the Jack the Ripper murders, which has its own cottage industry of books espousing to be the ultimate resolution. Curiously enough, these famous murders that have managed to live on through the decades through legend and debate actually took place around the same time, as the Ripper murders took place just 4 years prior to the Borden killings. Meaning it was similar types of papers selling to similar types of people who helped to first build the legend around these cases. Unlike the Ripper murders, however, the Borden killings at least had an identified main suspect that was put on trial for these crimes. A court case that was proclaimed to be one of those trials of the century that seemed to take place far more often than their name suggests, meaning that the whole thing was a bit of a media circus. Yet before I go any further into my kinda annual exploration into historical true crime, first, like always, I want to acknowledge the sources that I used for this episode, like Joseph Aiken Forty's Lizzie Borden on Trial, Murder, Ethnicity, and Gender, Edward D. Radden's Lizzie Borden The Untold Story, David Kent's 40 Whacks, New Evidence in the Life and Legend of Lizzie Borden, William L. Masterson's Lizzie Didn't Do It, Arnold R. Brown's Lizzie Borden, The Legend, The Truth, The Final Chapter, and Frank Spearing's Lizzie. And like always, a complete list of those sources and any others that I use like websites will be posted on this podcast Twitter and Ko-fi pages. And with all that being said, let's begin. Our story centers around the events of the 4th of August 1892 at the address of 92 2nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts. As you might imagine, as deep into the heart of summer as this was, the weather was quite hot, although maybe not quite as hot as legend would have you believe. Still, the weather was muggy and stifling in Fall River. As uncomfortable as this was in an era before air conditioning, the residents of 92 2nd Street, the Bordens, were having an especially hard time of it. As the prior day, the 3rd of August, two of the residents of the home, elderly married couple Andrew Borden and his wife Abby, both awoke in the night sick and vomiting. Sounds that Andrew's daughter Lizzie reported hearing through the wall that adjoined their 2 rooms, an illness commonly attributed to some old, presumably spoiled mutton that they had consumed. This presumption is due to mutton appearing repeatedly on the menu produced by the family servant Bridget. That being said, with mutton appearing so often from Saturday to Thursday the 4th on the family's menu, variously for breakfast, dinner, and supper on multiple days, it probably wasn't the same leg of mutton. Instead, the family would attribute the illness to some bread they had consumed, while Joseph Conforti attributes the illness to some fried swordfish they had for dinner that had then been left out and reheated for supper the night they got sick. With this being the time when dinner was the midday meal and supper was the evening meal. This illness was bad enough that Abby actually feared they had been poisoned. Andrew, on the other hand, would dismiss these fears. Indeed, while Abby would head across the street to see Dr. Seabury Bowen, who ultimately assured her that she was not in fact poisoned, Andrew not only responded to her initial concerns by declaring he would not pay for her visit, but he also subsequently more or less chased the doctor off when he came over to check on Abby later. The fear that someone was potentially targeting the family for harm apparently wasn't Abby's alone, as that same evening, Lizzie Borden, while visiting her friend Miss Alice Russell, would appear to be agitated and on edge as she repeated her stepmother Abby's fears that they were being poisoned. Specifically, she feared someone was poisoning their milk, which was delivered to the family's door early every morning. Lizzie would go on to tell her friend how she feared that her father, the rough, hard-nosed businessman that he was, had an enemy who was out to get them. In particular, she would tell Alice about a man who had come to see her father about some business, seemingly about renting space in the new commercial building he was having constructed in downtown Fall River. However, Andrew would tell the unidentified man something along the lines of, quote,
"I don't care to let my property for such business."
A response that, according to Lizzie, made the other man quite angry, resulting in her father ordering the visitor out of their home. Now, Lizzie would admit she could not be sure whether this particular individual was after them or not, but still, as Lizzie told her friend, quote,
"I'm afraid sometimes that somebody will do something to him. He is so discourteous to people."
As she recalled how her father had treated the doctor that very morning. These fears, Lizzie further insisted, weren't unfounded, as she went on to tell Alice about how their barn had twice been broken into, crimes that Alice tried to assure her friend were not connected to any threat to the family. Likely, she insisted, the break-ins had been done by some boys who were after Andrew's pigeons. Indeed, Andrew himself had responded to these break-ins by killing all his pigeons, a strangely petulant and deadly reaction that speaks in some ways to his character. Still, Lizzie was not comforted as she went on to tell of how one night upon arriving back at home, she had witnessed a man run around the house in the darkness. Plus, she pointed out how the house itself had been robbed the year prior in broad daylight, while Emma herself and their Irish maid were all in the home, with Lizzie finally declaring, quote,
"I feel as if I wanted to sleep with my eyes half open, with one eye open half the time for fear they will burn the house down over us."
This outburst of fear and concern the night before her father and stepmother would be murdered, for those who believe that Lizzie Borden was innocent, is seen as an indication that there was indeed someone out to get, if not the whole family, at the very least her father. Meanwhile, for those who believe that Lizzie Borden was guilty of the murders, this is proof of her premeditated planning. In this scenario, she was not actually afraid, as there wasn't really someone out to do members of her family harm other than herself. This then was simply Lizzie trying to lay the groundwork for the very crime that she herself was planning on committing the very next day, as she tried to make sure that people looked outside of the family for suspects in their deaths. Regardless, Lizzie would return home that night, and by that time the following day, half the members of the Borden household would be dead. To note, on the day in question, the 4th of August, Andrew's eldest daughter Emma was 15 miles away vacationing with some friends in Fairhaven. Indeed, she was not scheduled to return home for several weeks. However, there were still 5 people staying in the Borden residence on 2nd Street, as John Morse, Lizzie and Emma's uncle, their dead mother's brother, just happened to be visiting the family, having dropped in unexpectedly earlier that week. John, in fact, would be the very first to rise at 6 a.m. that morning, followed shortly after by the family's Irish maid Bridget, who came down from her hot attic room 15 minutes later. Bridget Sullivan, who both Lizzie and her sister Emma referred to as Maggie, the name of their previous Irish maid, had immigrated from Ireland in 1886 when she was 20 years old. Bridget was about 25 now and had been working for the Bordens for 3 years at this point. She worked 6 days a week and was responsible for cooking, washing, ironing, and sweeping. Bridget in particular was described as loyal to her employer, who in her mind was Mrs. Borden. On this morning, as she typically did, Bridget headed first down into the cellar to retrieve the fuel for the cast iron range in the kitchen, where she would do her cooking. After doing so and lighting the fire, Bridget retrieved the family's morning delivery of milk from the side door, and in doing so, she left the door itself open but the screen door locked as per usual in the summer. It was then, round about this time, 6:30 or so, that Andrew Borden and his second wife Abby came down the back stairs from their room. A breakfast of coffee, johnny cakes, cookies, bananas, leftover mutton, and mutton broth made from said leftover mutton was then served at 7. Andrew, you see, apparently had a fondness for cheap mutton, even though with his considerable wealth he could have afforded much better. A half hour later, Abby would ring a bell signaling to Bridget that they had finished. It was then the maid's opportunity to have her own breakfast before she cleared the table and started washing the dishes around 8. As the maid did so, Abby went up to her and Andrew's room to carry out her daily cleaning ritual, which involved carrying some water up there in a basin because, as we will see, while the home had some limited indoor plumbing, there was none on the second floor, and there was nothing like a bath or a shower with running water in the residence. Come 8:45 that morning, John Morris, Andrew's brother-in-law from his first marriage and Lizzie's uncle, departed planning to return around midday, as he had been invited to eat with the family by Andrew. In the meantime, John Morris walked a mile to the east to visit some other relatives on Pleasant Street. As for Andrew, after taking care of his own personal morning cleaning, he too departed the Borden home sometime around 9. As he did so, he headed a bit of a ways down 2nd Street to what was essentially the heart of Fall River, where the majority of his personal business concerns were. As he did so, he would have passed by the building that bore his name, the A.J. Borden building, which was still under construction but very nearly completed. After passing by his namesake, Andrew then stopped in at the Union Savings Bank, which he was president of. From there he went to the post office, the National Union Bank, and the First National Bank, where he served as a director. During which time he had a short discussion with other bank officials who noticed that Andrew looked quite tired and sick. After handling his banking business, Andrew headed over to a rental property on Main Street and then headed over to the A.J. Borden building to check in on some carpenters working therein. The fact that all these stops were within reasonable walking distance to his home was likely one of the reasons why Andrew Borden still resided in the relatively small structure on the exceedingly busy 2nd Street rather than among the other wealthy residents of Fall River up on the hill. Meanwhile, back in said Borden residence, Lizzie came down from her room around 9 a.m. When she did, the family's maid Bridget heard an exchange between Lizzie and her stepmother, who was at that moment dusting in the dining room. For her part, Lizzie was not particularly hungry, and so she wasn't interested in the mutton-based breakfast fare. Instead, she reportedly only ate a pear and a cookie or two. Bridget, meanwhile, was also not feeling particularly well, and so she retreated to the backyard where she stayed for 10 to 15 minutes to vomit before returning to washing the dishes and clean the stove. It was round about this time that Abby requested that Bridget wash the windows inside and out, as they were quote-unquote awful dirty. Following which time it's believed that Abby headed upstairs to change the pillowcases and generally straighten things up in the guest room while John Morris was out. Or at least that's where we assume she went, as this request to wash the windows marks the last time Bridget saw Abby alive. Not knowing what horrors the day had in store for the residents of the Borden household, Bridget set about cleaning the first floor windows, first closing them and then heading downstairs into the cellar to fetch a pail, before heading out through the side door of the house to retrieve a long handle and brush from the barn. As the maid came out from the barn, Lizzie appeared and asked if the maid, who she called Maggie, was going to start by watching the windows from the outside. Bridget confirmed that she was and told Lizzie that since she won't be around, Lizzie didn't need to lock the side door. That being said, it would be okay if she wanted to, as the maid could still get water from the barn to finish her task. Lizzie, though, chose to leave the side door unlocked. This is a crucial moment of our tale, as for those who believe in Lizzie Borden's innocence, this was just that, an innocent mistake that potentially provided an opening for the murderer to enter the otherwise locked house. On the other hand, those who believe that Lizzie was truly responsible for the deaths that would occur that day, this was the perfect opportunity for her to lay the groundwork to lay the blame for the murder she was about to commit at the feet of some unknown mysterious third party. Regardless, the side door of the Borden residence was left unhooked as Bridget set to work. This included working on the side of the house closest to their neighbor Dr. Kelly, during which time Bridget took the opportunity to chat with Dr. Kelly's Irish servant over the fence. This is important as this was on the far side of the house and Bridget could not see the now unlocked side door. That being said, she could still see through the windows to the first floor, and as she was washing the windows, Bridget took no note of anyone on the first floor. Not Abby, not Lizzie, and no mysterious invader either. She also did not notice anyone around the property as she cleaned the windows and made multiple trips back to the barn to get fresh water. In all, it took Bridget at least an hour to clean all the windows from the outside before she headed back inside to finish her task from within. Throughout this time, presumably both Abby and Lizzie were inside the home, which is crucial as it is believed that it was likely sometime during this hour between 9 and 10 a.m. that Abby's murderer entered the guest room and swiftly assaulted her, the first blow causing her to fall to the floor, at which point the mysterious assailant rained down blow after blow to the back of her skull and neck. Based on later examinations of the body, it seems that whoever the assailant was, they managed to take Abby completely by surprise, as there were no signs of struggle, including no overturned furniture. Death then, it seemed, was almost immediate, yet still 19 blows in all rained down on the defenseless and likely quickly dead woman. The strikes were brutal, frantic, and not controlled, as in addition to the 5-inch hole in her skull, multiple blows missed the back of Abby's head, with one scalping the side of her head and another striking her in the back. Now, Lizzie, when questioned later, would claim to have been downstairs throughout much of the time Bridget was outside, which was an important claim to make, as had she been upstairs in her bedroom that was so close to the guest room, one would assume she would have heard something when her stepmother was being brutally murdered. A claim that seems questionable given that Bridget had not noticed Lizzie downstairs as she was washing the windows from the outside, and nor did Bridget see her when she popped in to grab a dipper to toss soapy water on the windows. Nor did Lizzie appear to be downstairs when Bridget started washing the windows from the inside. Indeed, when Andrew Borden, after spending about an hour and a half tending to his business downtown, returned home around 10:40 that morning, it seemed that Lizzie was upstairs in her bedroom. As when Andrew approached his triple-locked front door, Bridget heard his arrival and went to open the door for him. As she did so, though, she was frustrated by the multiple locks, a situation that apparently caused some sort of colorful exclamation from the Irish maid, which she remembers eliciting a laugh from Lizzie as she was coming down the stairs from the part of the house that contained both her room and the guest room, which at this point potentially contained Abby's brutalized body. Meanwhile, as Bridget returned to her work, she overheard Lizzie tell her father that Abby had received a note and gone out. Another moment of either coincidence or calculation by Lizzie. As it was this assertion by Lizzie, whether mistaken or calculated, that ensured that no one was all that curious as to where Abby was in that moment, thus ensuring that no one looked for her and found her body if she was indeed dead by this point in time. Regardless, Lizzie went about setting up an ironing board upon which she intended to iron 8 to 10 handkerchiefs, while her father Andrew sat in the room across from her reading a newspaper. Bridget, meanwhile, set about cleaning the dining room windows from the inside. It was during this time that Lizzie asked a maid if she intended to go out that afternoon, because if she did, she should make sure to lock the doors, as Lizzie also intended to depart, meaning there would likely be no one in the home, as she again reminded the maid that Mrs. Borden, as she typically referred to Abby, had received a note that someone was sick and had left the house. A comment that led Bridget to inquire who was sick, as it was unusual for Abby to leave without informing the maid where she was going. Lizzie replied that she did not know. All she knew was her stepmother had received a note that morning and had informed Lizzie she was heading out, and since she intended to stop off at the store to pick up food for dinner before returning, she had asked Lizzie if she wanted anything in particular, to which Lizzie had replied she wasn't feeling good and didn't intend on eating the noontime meal. Apparently satisfied with this explanation, Bridget finished cleaning all the windows and rinsed out the cloth she had been using before hanging them behind the stove to dry. As she was doing this, Lizzie approached the maid again, informing her of a sale on cotton fabric in town that she might be interested in. Bridget seemed somewhat interested in the sale, but for the moment she was tired and still not feeling well. So a few minutes before 11 a.m., the maid headed upstairs to her room in the attic to lay down for a bit. As she did so, the similarly ill-feeling Andrew laid down as well in the sitting room with his legs draped over the side of his small horsehair sofa. It's at this point that Abby's murderer finished their bloody work that morning as they stood over the reclining Andrew Borden's head and, like they had done with Abby, started raining down blows. In doing so, they only struck him 10 times, unlike the 19 times she had been struck. And again, this was a brutal and imprecise crime, as the blows struck multiple locations along his face, effectively destroying his features until he would later be described as hardly recognizable, while the wall behind the couch was splattered with blood. Most importantly, the blows crushed his skull, his brain, and severed his carotid artery, thoroughly killing him. In doing so, it seems as if this mysterious assailant again managed to take their victim completely by surprise, as there were no signs of struggle. Indeed, according to the doctor who conducted the initial examination, it seemed as if Andrew Borden was asleep when the murder took place. Now, while it's unclear when exactly Abby was murdered that morning, I'll talk more about the various theories and ideas surrounding that in the 3rd episode, when talking about some of the theories about who was responsible. The window for Andrew Borden's murder is much more narrow, as it had to have happened sometime between 3 to 4 minutes before 11 when Bridget headed upstairs to lay down, and 10 minutes after 11 when the maid heard Lizzie shouting. As when Bridget came downstairs, Lizzie declared that someone must have gotten into their home and murdered her father. Seeking aid, Lizzie then sent Bridget across the street to fetch the family doctor Seabury Bowen. Upon finding the doctor not at home, Bridget returned, at which point she questioned Lizzie where she had been, to which Lizzie said she had been in the backyard when she heard a groan and noticed that the screen door was wide open. That was when she hurried inside and came upon the scene in the living room. As for right now, since Bridget was unable to find the doctor, Lizzie next sent her down the street to inform Miss Alice Russell of what had happened, as Lizzie declared she could not be alone in the house. Shortly after the maid departed again, the Borden's next-door neighbor Adelaide Churchill, who had just returned from grocery shopping, glanced out her window and saw Lizzie standing inside the screen door. As she did, Adelaide could not help but note that Lizzie looked to be, quote, very white. Sensing that something was amiss, Adelaide called out her window to Lizzie asking what was wrong, to which Lizzie called back requesting Adelaide to come over as someone had killed her father. Hearing this, Adelaide rushed next door, and much like Bridget had done, she asked Lizzie where she had been when the crime had occurred, to which Lizzie responded she had gone out to the barn to look for a piece of iron. Adelaide then asked after Lizzie's stepmother Abby, wondering where she was, and Lizzie again repeated the tale that Abby had gotten a note to go see someone who was sick. Bridget, who had returned by this point, suggested that Abby might have gone to see her half-sister, but Lizzie suddenly wasn't so sure, as she said something along the lines of, quote,
I don't know that she is killed too, for I thought I heard her come in.
It's at this point that Lizzie asked the maid if she would go check upstairs to see if Abby was up there somewhere. Bridget, though, was afraid and refused to go alone. She also may have been uncomfortable in doing so, as to get to the front stairs she would have to go past Andrew's dead and mutilated body. Adelaide, though, would offer to go with her, and so the two women climbed the front stairwell until they reached the point where they could just see over the 2nd floor. From there they could see into the guest bedroom, where they beheld Abby's body. Both victims had now been found, and soon this crime would not only be the talk of the town, but the talk of much of the country. The wealth of the victims, the brutality of the murders, with the number of blows delivered to both Abby and Andrew far exceeding the number needed to end their lives, and the fact that it had all happened in broad daylight, made this an exceedingly shocking crime. Indeed, even for a country that not all that long prior to this had been through a particularly bloody and violent civil war, these crimes were particularly distressing. So far, I have covered the generally accepted account of the events that took place inside the Borden home on the morning of the 4th of August 1892, up until the time when the bloody and brutalized bodies of Abby and Andrew Borden were discovered, having been struck 19 and 11 times by a mysterious individual wielding what was likely a hatchet of some kind. Following this discovery, the police would begin their investigation and eventually come to the conclusion that Lizzie Borden was responsible for this vile crime. Before we get there, however, as I intend to cover the investigation and the early legal proceedings that ultimately led to Lizzie Borden's so-called trial of the century in the next episode, first I want to continue setting the stage to help you better understand the where and when this crime took place in. Now, this crime took place in the city of Fall River, which was/is located some 50 miles south of Boston, a city of rolling hills and a city that at the time was a bit of a Gilded Age boomtown, where the wealthy for the most part tended to live in the northern end of Fall River on a plateau known simply as The Hill. It was here that the richest and most well-off families built and lived in their mansions. Queen Anne and colonial revival-style homes surrounded by large plots of land represented a fair number of the structures sitting atop the hill, with the most coveted street on the hill, the place where the elite of the elite most wanted to live, being Rock Street, which ran through the heart of this section of Fall River and connected it with the downtown of the city. This part of the city was primarily populated by so-called native-born individuals and families, by which I mean these were not Native Americans as we would think of them. Instead, these were white Protestants who had been born in America. In other words, not recent immigrants, an important distinction to be made as we will see. In the meantime, the reason why the hill was such an attractive spot for the wealthy to build their mansions was due to the cool breezes that blew in and helped with the summer heat, the great views afforded from the plateau, including those that overlooked the bay, and also the fact that this location provided those who lived there some distance between them and the source of their wealth, the city's cotton mills. This burgeoning wealth had its origins back in the early 1800s, when it was realized that the Quequechan River, which is an English version of the Pecasset Indian word for falling river, was perfect for powering industrial equipment. Additionally, since the town was located on the coast and had access to the Atlantic Ocean, it was almost perfectly set up to become a major textile industrial site. Indeed, southern cotton could be brought north by ship to be processed in their river-powered mills at far less of a price than it cost to transport the cotton to more inland industrial centers. Then, come the 1850s, the wealth generated in Fall River would only increase with the introduction of steam engines that only enhanced the city's viability as a manufacturing center. As while the machinery would still need water to make steam and keep the engines from overheating, they no longer had to rely upon powerful river currents to provide the power, thereby allowing mills to be built in more locations as Fall River further industrialized at a faster rate than their competitors. Indeed, the city was so industrialized that its official seal, which was adopted in 1854, would proudly feature smokestacks creating clouds of thick, sooty smoke that hung over the town, which for us today sounds like a bad thing and something you would not want to advertise. Come to Fall River, we have terrible polluted air. In those days, though, those huge smokestacks and the pollution that they spewed out wasn't seen in that way. Instead, it was seen as a sign of progress and prosperity. Still, that did not mean that the wealthy wanted to live particularly close to those smoke-spewing mills, which is one reason why they preferred to live up on the hill well away from the factories. Due to this industrialization, Fall River became the largest cotton mill center in the U.S. In particular, they specialized in taking raw southern cotton and spinning it into coarse gray cloth that could be bleached and printed upon. Indeed, Fall River produced so much cloth that not only could they not handle the bleaching and printing of it, but no other place could hope to compete with them in this part of the market. This was because no one could compete on their scale. As they produced so much, they effectively drove the price of the cloth down to the point that the only way to make a profit was to produce it on such a mass scale. Fall River then came to be known as Spindle City, as it was the home of some 40 corporations that controlled nearly 100 mills that contained millions of spinning wheels or spindles that wound the cotton thread, with many of these corporations being controlled by a fairly small and interconnected group of families. Now, of course, these mills didn't just work on the power of steam alone, as they were powered by the labor of immigrants, and much like how the wealthy families owning these mills did not want to live in the shadow of the pollution-spewing smokestacks, they also wanted to be separated from the people whose labor helped to generate all the wealth they enjoyed. Indeed, the flight of the city's wealthiest families up to the hill had as much to do with the pollution from the mills as it had to do with getting away from the city's growing immigrant population, an immigrant population that is typically divided into three main groups. First, there were the French Canadians who had fled infertile farms in Quebec by the tens of thousands, coming south across the border looking for work. Then there were the Portuguese, who were seen as the lowest of the low, partially due to their slightly darker skin. The Portuguese were also the newest arrivals, while the largest and first of these notably Catholic immigrant groups to arrive in Fall River were the Irish. This rapidly growing immigrant population was both alarming and beneficial to the so-called native-born residents of Fall River. Alarming in part because they were scary foreigners with their own languages, traditions, and religion. As even though Protestants and Catholics are both by definition Christian, the Protestant native-born residents of the United States looked at these Catholic newcomers with suspicion. Yet at the same time, the native-born residents of Fall River had little choice but to accept their arrival, as this growing population of immigrants, and specifically their labor, was a big reason behind the city's explosive economic growth. Those who benefited the most from this growth were of course the select group of interconnected native-born families that owned the various textile mills. These families grew enormously wealthy off the burgeoning textile industry, with a not insignificant amount of their wealth being generated due to how they predictably took advantage of their workers. For example, while the law in Massachusetts limited workdays to just 10 hours, the owners of these corporations knew of and exploited loopholes in the laws if they didn't just break them outright. This was also true of child labor laws, as they took advantage of poor, desperate immigrant families who often had no choice but to, willingly, allow their children to work in the dangerous mills as they really had no other option. The owners of these mills especially liked their thousands of age 10 and under employees, as they could pay these children far less than their adult male co-workers. It was then these low wages and the children who received them to work in and around dangerous machinery that truly enabled Fall River to function like it did. The same was also true of their female employees, as the owners of these mills liked to employ women as it could pay them far less than their male counterparts. All this helped to guarantee profits for the owners, profits that were, of course, not shared with the workers. However, whenever profits were not quite as high as the mill owners expected, they weren't shy about cutting their workers' wages to make up the difference. Now, of course, the workers would go on strike in response to such cuts, but as I've covered in other episodes that focus more on labor conditions and unrest in this era, I'm thinking this series on the Patterson strike and the Triangle Shirtwaist episode should probably have more information. These wage cuts were often tactical moves by the mill owners. These cuts, you see, tended to happen on a schedule. Namely, they cut wages so as to practically encourage a strike at a time of year when they didn't really need workers, as they already had an abundance of material stored away that had yet to be sold. This way they could sit back without paying their workers who were on strike and sell off their back stock during a time of year when there wasn't as much demand. This oftentimes allowed them to wait their workers out, and by the time they had no choice but to come back and work in the mills, it was right around the time to start ramping up for production again. Unsurprisingly then, labor discontent became common among Fall River's immigrant population, something that no matter how calculated some of these might have been by the owners, still unnerved the wealthy native-born population, causing them to distrust their new immigrant neighbors all the more. They couldn't be content with the crumbs they were given. They couldn't just accept their place. They had to keep stirring up trouble and being disruptive. This was especially problematic because while the immigrant population was growing rapidly, the quote-unquote native-born Yankee population was shrinking, some of which was due to middle and upper-class Yankee women beginning to practice contraception and abortion, which was seen as a bad thing by those who feared being outnumbered by these scary immigrants. Somehow this all sounds familiar. These same voices also complained about women getting educations and working. Not familiar at all. Choices that these individuals suggested weakened women's reproductive organs. Meanwhile, thanks to their growing population, the immigrants of Fall River, despite the efforts of these so-called native-born Yankees, started to gain in power. Indeed, they were becoming the majority population in the city, which was frightening for the native-born and especially the founding families of Fall River, as they had never had their positions of power challenged in such a way. It was then due to this external pressure that these native-born Protestants or Yankees started behaving more as a unified group, as their shared history and heritage suddenly began to be seen as more important than it ever had at any point previous to this. Yet, while the Yankees managed to block these newcomers from certain places, block from their societal gatherings and the like, it was becoming increasingly obvious, much to the unease of these native-born Yankees, that the immigrants would only be held off for so long. In a lot of ways, it started with the police force, where the Irish soon had a prominent presence. From there, they started making inroads into the city's Board of Aldermen, and then in 1885, Fall River had its first Irish mayor. These gains of political power by the Irish were very problematic for the native-born Yankees, as not only did this threaten their vaunted positions in society, but these newly elected Irish politicians started passing some inconvenient legislation, like, for example, legislation that limited the hours children under 10 could work, legislation that required additional safety measures in the mills, and legislation that granted laborers the ability to address their grievances with their employers through a committee. All things that threatened to cut into the profits of the various mills and businesses owned by the prominent Yankee families. Additionally, these new Irish politicians also looked to fund new public projects, radical things like schools, roads, sewers, and water systems, by taxing the wealthy residents of the Hill, who had previously been all but exempt from such a burden. Also of note, 1885, the same year that saw the election of the city's first Irish mayor, also saw the founding of the working-class Irish newspaper, the Fall River Globe. To note, this wasn't the first Irish newspaper in town, as the Irish Democratic newspaper, the Fall River Herald, held that honor, having been founded in 1872. Yet, unlike its older competitor, the Globe was much more rebellious and combative when it came to the wealthy Yankee residents of Fall River. Most notably, though, even though at that point the Irish had already begun to assume positions of power within Fall River, the uncomfortable reality for the city's Yankee population was they were far from done. Indeed, the city's immigrant population would grow by leaps and bounds in the 1890s, a decade which saw Fall River's population swell from just under 75,000 residents to nearly 105,000, with much of that growth coming from the city's immigrant population, as according to the 1900 federal census, Fall River had the highest percentage of immigrants in a city with a population of over 100,000 people. As this happened, the fears of the native-born Yankee population only grew, as did their determination to hold on to what power they could. This included jealously keeping the immigrants, regardless of how high they crawled, out of their elite social circles, and by exerting their economic power through the mills they owned and profited off of, none of which endeared the wealthy Yankee families that held onto this power to the immigrant population they were trying to keep under their heel. It was then this environment that helped to dictate how the Borden murders and the accusations against Lizzie would be handled by the residents and newspapers in and around Fall River. So far, I've covered the actual events of the 4th of August 1892, as well as the current state of affairs of Fall River, the city where the Borden murders took place in. It's at this point, then, that I want to begin zooming back in on the main characters in this bloody real-life drama, specifically the aforementioned Bordens. While today we mainly know the name of one Borden, Lizzie, at the time of the murders, the Bordens were a fairly prominent New England family. One that had been in the region almost from the very beginning of the New England colonies, as even though the Bordens were not one of the most venerated families, the ones who had taken part in the Mayflower voyage in 1620, they had come over in 1630 as a part of the Puritan Great Migration. This granted them an advantageous position to grow in wealth, size, and power over the subsequent centuries. Indeed, by 1803, half of the 18 families that were residing in Fall River when it incorporated were Bordens. Realize, though, with such a sizable family tree, not all the branches were equal. Some were much more prosperous than others, and indeed the branch that eventually led to Lizzie Borden had not been one of those that had accumulated a sizable fortune over the years. Her father Andrew would then be instrumental in building his own personal fortune. Again, though, to be clear, even though this branch of the family before Andrew was not prosperous, the same was not true of other branches of the family tree, as multiple Borden families due to laying claim to the land around the Quequechan would be among those who initially profited off of using the river to power the early saw and grist mills that formed the future economic foundations of the city. Then, by the early 1800s, they were among the first to realize the river's potential in powering industrial machinery. In fact, several Bordens were among those who spearheaded the industrialization of Fall River. These Borden clans then would become quite powerful as their economic vision was realized. Indeed, the New York Times would note that, quote,
Fall River has been more or less controlled by the Dorfies and the Bordens, who appear and reappear as officers in most of the corporations.
These two families then, the Dorfies and the Bordens, were some of the oldest, wealthiest, and most powerful families in the city, thanks to the fact that they had been well positioned to guide and take advantage of the city's industrialization. The Times would also lay out how these families had maintained and perpetuated this power and wealth through the generations, as the paper would explain the, quote,
Bordens and Dorfies have put their sons, brothers, uncles, sons-in-laws, and cousins into office and permitted them to do nearly as they choose. This is the way the Bordens and Dorfies continually break out like a smallpox in all the industrial enterprises of that city.
To be clear, it wasn't just the industrialization of the textile industry that fueled these families' growing wealth and power. You see, these wealthy Borden families and others like the Dorfies would use the wealth they gained from their mills to gain control of the town's railroads, steamships, and banks, essentially then making it so they controlled the wealth-generating textile mills, the way in which their raw materials and their finished products were shipped into and out of town respectively, and they even controlled the financial institutions that loaned the money that helped to fuel and expand their empires. As they did all this, these newly elite families also intermarried, thereby further fortifying their power and wealth all the more. Indeed, it was due to the fact that the Bordens of Fall River were so well known in the Northeast from New England to New York City that helped to ensure the murders of Andrew and Abby became such a huge deal. Speaking of Andrew Borden, he was just shy of 70 years old at the time of his murder, during which time he managed to become quite wealthy while also having a well-earned reputation for being a penny pincher. Something that can simply be illustrated by the fact that despite having more than enough money to live comfortably up on the hill with others who held similar or even smaller fortunes, Andrew's family continued to live on 2nd Street, a busy residential and commercial street a short block away from South Main Street, an area of town that notably sat in between the immigrants who lived close to the mills they worked in and the wealthiest of the wealthy who tended to live up on the more distant aforementioned hill. In other words, the Borden house on 2nd Street where the murders took place in was most definitely not located in the most desirable part of the city. As for the house itself, it was also not the kind of place where you would expect one of the wealthiest and most prominent men in Fall River to reside. In addition to sitting on one of the busiest streets in the city, a heavily trafficked, noisy area, the house had no front yard, as it sat practically right up against the sidewalk, separated from it only by a white picket fence, making it a very noisy location, with people and wagons constantly going up and down the street past the home, creating quite the din. Additionally, the Borden home also stood out from the nicer dwellings surrounding it, as it was fairly drab and narrow in comparison to the significantly more spacious and elegant homes that sat around them, which is to say that it was a dwelling that was well beneath the type of structure that Andrew could have afforded with his significant wealth. Indeed, the Borden home was quite the odd structure. This was largely due to the fact that it had originally been a two-family dwelling that had been converted into a single-family dwelling. In doing so, Andrew likely could have afforded to make more drastic changes to the quite unusual layout, but chose not to, likely because that would have cost money, thereby leaving his family to make do with the long but narrow structure that only measured 20 feet wide, whose floor plan left no room for hallways. Instead, to get from one room to the next, you had to pass through a different room, a situation that was manageable enough on the first floor, but created issues on the second floor where the bedrooms were. As a result, the Bordens locked the doors between the rooms and came up with rules to get around the house so as to create some kind of privacy. Rules like using the front stairs to access Lizzie, Emma's, and a guest room, while the back stairs were reserved for Andrew's and Abby's bedroom. Additionally, since Lizzie and her parents' rooms were up against one another, the door between the rooms were locked by a hook on her side, while Andrew and Abby kept a dresser pressed against the door on their side. Additionally, Lizzie also kept a desk up against the door that led from her room into the guest bedroom. Then on top of these rules, everyone kept the doors to their bedrooms locked at night. This was on top of the 3 locks on the front door that consisted of a standard key lock, a spring lock, and a deadbolt, and the 3 locks on the side door which also included a deadbolt. Then, as if that was not enough, they also had locked dressers and the like in their rooms. Now, some have pointed to this situation as proof of the simmering tensions within the house that eventually led to the brutal murders of the 4th of August 1892. Others, meanwhile, chalk up these precautions as being the result of an incident that happened a year before the murders while Andrew and Abby were staying out at one of the family's other properties in Swansea. During this time when Lizzie, Emma, and Bridget were at home, a burglar managed to gain entrance to the residence and break into Andrew and Abby's bedroom, where they stole, among other things, $80, an additional $25 to $30 worth of gold, Abby's gold watch and chain, and various other pieces of jewelry. Notably, none of the 3 women in the house heard the thief, and nor did anyone in the neighborhood see anyone suspicious coming or going from the house. This is again another one of the facts that can and have been interpreted in multiple different ways, oftentimes depending upon how one feels about whether Lizzie was guilty of the murders or not. For example, those who believe in her innocence can point to this as supporting evidence that it was possible for an unknown external party to secretly gain entrance to the Borden home without the residents inside of it or their neighbors noticing. Meanwhile, those who believe Lizzie guilty of the murders tend to believe that there was no mysterious external party for this crime either. Instead, they believe that not only was Lizzie responsible for the murders, but she was also responsible for this theft as well. Indeed, they see this theft as another sign of her resentment toward her father and stepmother. To further expand upon this conclusion, these individuals tend to point to Andrew's eventual assertion that the robbers would likely never be caught as an indication that he knew that it was an inside job and Lizzie was responsible. Regardless, back to the structure itself, while the house did have the modern convenience of a coal furnace that provided heat throughout the home, it lacked the kind of indoor plumbing you would expect in the residence of someone as wealthy as Andrew Borden. Indeed, the only running water in the house came from a small sink near the back door and the sink in the water closet in the basement, which was the one and only toilet in the house. There was then no running water on the second floor. Instead, they still used chamber pots overnight, the contents of which were either taken down to the toilet or dumped in the backyard, although Andrew was the only one who chose to employ that tact. Meanwhile, the family handled their daily cleaning routines by carrying a basin of water up to their rooms and refreshing themselves that way, as there was apparently no such thing as a bath or shower in the home. Additionally, the narrow, oddly laid-out structure on 2nd Street also lacked electricity and a telephone, both things that by that time you would expect to be in the home of one as wealthy as Andrew Borden. In fact, the home didn't even have a more primitive gas line to fuel illuminating gas lights. Instead, the Bordens had to rely on kerosene lamps, and Andrew made sure to limit the use of even that. Andrew also, for the most part, did not seem to have spent much money furnishing the home. As a mason and building contractor who was hired by the state to search the house following the murders, would tell the Fall River Herald, quote,
I would say the house was furnished very plainly, notably so. The ordinary mechanic with an ordinary salary has his house furnished as well. There was nothing in the house to indicate the wealth of the people who lived there.
Now, Andrew Borden's penny-pinching nature can likely be attributed to the fact that, as I previously mentioned, he did not hail from one of the wealthier parts of the extended Borden clan. You see, by the time Andrew was born, there were some 50 different Borden families that in some cases were by this point only vaguely related, with Andrew's part of the family in particular not enjoying the kind of wealth and power many other Bordens had. Indeed, Andrew's father was listed as a gardener, a laborer, and a fishmonger, suggesting that he never really held on to steady work for long, nor advanced very far. Growing up in this situation seemed to motivate Andrew, and unlike a number of the other wealthy Bordens from that time, Andrew would be very much self-made. As he worked to rise above his humble beginnings, Andrew soon started to earn a reputation as a prudent businessman who, as a cabinet maker, opened his own furniture store in 1845. A furniture store which he then expanded into the funeral business, something which may sound strange at first until you realize that Andrew was using his cabinet-making skills to build caskets. In doing so, he reportedly offered a money-back guarantee that his caskets would preserve their loved ones better than his competitors, which honestly feels like a pretty safe guarantee to make, as who was digging up dead bodies to compare them? Andrew also further combined his furniture and funeral businesses by renting out furniture for wakes. In doing so, though, there seemed to have been accusations of him overselling the bereaved, by which I mean he apparently talked survivors into more lavish ceremonies than they could actually afford. Andrew would then to agree to allow them to hold off on making payments in exchange for a lien on their property which he would then reportedly eventually purchase at a discounted rate. Andrew, though, would not spend the money he made from these potentially less than ethical business practices, but instead saved it so he could invest it by taking advantage of Fall River's booming economy. Andrew would invest in a streetcar line and in any number of the numerous mills popping up around town. He even eventually managed to become the director of several mills and banks in Fall River. Specifically, he would become a director of the BMC Durfee Safe Deposit and Trust Company and a director of the First National Bank, while also serving as the director of the Glove Merchants and Troy Mills, in addition to being the president of the Union Savings Bank. Andrew also managed to grow his wealth through real estate deals as he invested in the city's growing downtown real estate as well as in farms in the surrounding area that had been foreclosed upon and were now cheap. Andrew would then oftentimes turn around and sell those farms for a profit while he typically held onto his holdings downtown. That being said, he would hold on to a pair of farms, one of which likely earned him some income as well as provided the family with their daily supply of milk. His biggest earner, though, promised to be the 3-story red brick building on South Main Street that bore his name. It should be noted, though, in addition to rumors of shady practices with his funeral business, Andrew also apparently had a reputation among his tenants for being cold-hearted, as it was common for renters to find themselves tossed out onto the street if they missed a single rent payment. Andrew, you see, was all about business and accumulating wealth, which also meant he had no real interest in spending, much less sharing his money. Indeed, despite his considerable wealth, unlike many others in his class, Andrew was not known for any acts of charity or for being particularly civic-minded. Indeed, Andrew would not even give the church that his daughter Lizzie attended a deal on some property that they very much wanted. Andrew, regardless of his youngest daughter's devotion, was not a particularly religious man himself. So, since he figured the church seemed to be doing quite well for itself, it only made sense for them to pay the same amount that he would ask of anyone else looking to buy the property. This despite the fact that it's not like he really needed more money, as between all of his various holdings at the time of his death, Andrew was worth some $300,000, or roughly over $10 million in today's money. Yet, despite all of this wealth, as we saw with the Borden home on 2nd Street, Andrew insisted on living well below what he could afford. Indeed, he seemed to keep a tight grip on the family money, only giving his wife and daughters a $4 a week allowance, an amount which was a bit less than a skilled female spinner in one of Fall River's mills could make for a 60-hour work week, meaning it wasn't nothing, but it wasn't a lavish handout by any means. Meanwhile, their Irish maid Bridget Sullivan, who the sisters called Maggie, received half that amount. Now, as for the family, back in 1845, then 23-year-old Andrew Borden married 21-year-old Sarah Morse. Together they had 3 daughters. Emma was the first, born in 1851. Then came Alice Ether, who was born in 1856, but Alice would tragically die before reaching her 2nd birthday, an all too common occurrence in those days. Lizzie then was the youngest of their children, being born in 1860. The fact that he had yet another daughter was a bit of a disappointment for Andrew, who at 38 saw this as potentially his last chance to have a son to carry on his name. So, lacking a son, he opted to give Lizzie his name as her middle name, thus making her Lizzie Andrew Borden. By the time of the murders, Lizzie was 32 years old and unmarried, which by the standards of those days qualified her as a spinster just like her older sister. That being said, both sisters were far from unique in New England in those days, as an increasing number of women in the region were choosing for one reason or another to not marry. Indeed, this was much more common in New England than in the rest of the country. In the 1870s, for example, while the national average of unmarried women was 11%, in New England more than 22% of the native-born women were single. Some of the women chose this path because it rejected the demanding and confining institution that was Victorian marriage, while others simply found their choices and husbands too lacking to willingly commit themselves to such a restricted fate. Others, meanwhile, made this choice so they could pursue careers and become the so-called new woman of the age, which, to be clear, did not describe either Borden's sister. although Emma would spend 4 months at Wheaton Seminary pursuing a higher education before eventually quitting and leaving for good. Instead, these sisters more represented the middle to upper class native-born Protestant who most defined and identified themselves with the aspects of Victorian womanhood. As such, the idea of having a job was out of the question, as women were not supposed to work outside of the household. Work inside the household, meanwhile, was also ideally handed off to servants if at all possible, so that these women could keep their minds focused on proper things like manners, high society, and religion. For Lizzie, religion really seemed to be her calling, despite neither her father nor her older sister Emma being particularly pious. Lizzie seemed to really start embracing religion around age 27, at which point she became a regular and visible member of the Rock Street Central Church, which was also probably the most prominent church in Fall River, as it could regularly seat some 1,200 individuals, but on special occasions it was known to increase capacity to 1,800. Additionally, its location on Rock Street, the most sought-after and desirable street in the most desirable section of the city, made it a kind of trendsetter among the city's religious institutions, as the Rock Street Central Church's impressive Victorian Gothic stone edifice seemed to inspire other churches in town to also relocate to Rock Street. As for Lizzie, she didn't just attend church services either, as she was also a Sunday school teacher and was recognized as a prominent young leader in the church. Unlike her father, it seems Lizzie had earned a reputation for being charitable and active in the community. Among other things, she was the secretary and treasurer of Christian Endeavor, a society dedicated to encouraging religion among young people. She was also a member of a women's group that visited and brought gifts to sick people around Fall River, and who also organized Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners for poor children. Now, to be clear, as charitable as these impulses were, this was still one of those groups of wealthy individuals who offered brief moments of aid and respite for the poor without ever really concerning themselves with the factors that were creating this level of poverty, meaning the way their families ran the mills, ensuring maximum profits for themselves while keeping the workers poor and desperate. That being said, it seems that part of the reason why Lizzie was asked to serve as treasurer for multiple charitable groups in Fall River was because she was known to make up for any shortfalls in their books out of her own pocket. She was also known to, on multiple occasions, quietly take care of an old retired teacher who needed a medical procedure or some other aid. Lizzie, it seems that, unlike her father, at least to some degree saw the money she had access to as a tool to help others. Lizzie also differed from her father in that she didn't seem satisfied with the cheapest possible option. Lizzie, for example, seemed to have a taste for fashion, as she owned a number of fancy dresses and even an expensive sealskin cape. She also seemed to quite enjoy taking part in a grand tour of Europe, which had been an exceedingly rare and expensive gift from her father on her 30th birthday. During this trip, Lizzie traveled with her friends around Europe, visiting England, Scotland, France, Switzerland, Italy, and Germany. In her letters from this time, Lizzie would describe with some apparent excitement the museums, parks, and especially the theaters they visited while abroad. Lizzie seemed to have a great love for the theater, and this trip enabled her to see plays put on by some of the greatest actors in the world. Yet, for as much fun as she seemed to have on this journey, Lizzie couldn't help but dread the prospect of returning home to Fall River, something which she reportedly confessed to her cousin Anna Borden, who she shared a cabin with on the return trip. Lizzie longed for the freedom and adventure of the world she had just experienced, and hated the thought of returning to that miserable little house and a stepmother who she did not like. Which brings us to the topic of Abby Borden, Andrew's second wife. You see, in 1863, when Lizzie was just shy of 3 years old, her 39-year-old mother Sarah died of uterine and spine disease. This left Andrew a widower with responsibility to raise 2 daughters aged 12 and 2, something which he was neither well-equipped or likely particularly interested in doing, as he was, like always, preoccupied with his business concerns. Meaning what he needed was a wife who would run the house and raise his children, which is where Abby came in. She came from a working-class family with a tinsmith father. Abby's situation became quite complicated when she was 32 years old and her mother died, following which her father married a woman who was 33, and the pair soon had a daughter they named Sarah. That being said, as unusual as his situation was, Abby would, despite the age difference, become quite close with young Sarah. The union between 37-year-old Abby, who was by definition a spinster, and the widower Andrew Borden, then was quite possibly a marriage of convenience, or even a bit of a business arrangement. in that Abby got out of an uncomfortable situation at home with a stepmother who was only 1 year her senior, while Andrew got a wife to look after the household and raise his daughters, a situation that has led to speculation that this was a loveless marriage, a supposition that is supported by the fact that Abby never would become pregnant and that Andrew never wore a wedding ring. Indeed, the only ring he ever wore was an inexpensive band given to him by Lizzie. As for Abby herself, she didn't really seem to have many if any friends. Instead, her closest confidant through the years would be her younger sister Sarah. Still, Abby was generally described as being warm and gentle. Horace Benson, who for several years lived next to the Bordens, for example, would describe Abby as a, quote,
kindly-hearted, lovable woman who tried but ineffectually to win the love of the stepdaughters.
Indeed, there just never seemed to be a real close and loving bond between Abby and her two stepdaughters, something which may have been a result of the closeness of Lizzie and Emma. Indeed, before their mother Sarah's death, Emma was summoned to her bedside, and Sarah had her 12-year-old daughter promise her that she would always look after baby Lizzie. It's even been suggested that one of the reasons why Emma had remained single was because she had put so much of her focus on caring for Lizzie so as to keep her promise to their mother. Speaking of which, Emma never referred to Abby as mother, as unlike Lizzie, Emma very much remembered their mother Sarah. So when Andrew remarried, the then 14-year-old Emma insisted on using her father's new wife's first name. Lizzie, meanwhile, seemingly did call Abby mother for a time, yet crucially 5 years before the murders, the relationship between the sisters and their stepmother took a decided turn for the worse. The trouble seemingly started in 1887 when Abby's father died. When he did, the family home was left equally to his widow and his daughter from said marriage, Abby's half-sister Sarah. This was fine until the widow needed money and wanted to sell her share of the house. The problem was Abby's half-sister Sarah and her family were currently living in said house and could not afford to buy out her mother's share. At which point Abby came to her young half-sister's aid as she somehow managed to convince Andrew to come up with the $1,500 to buy out her stepmother's share in the house so that Sarah and her family could continue to live there. Now, apparently Emma and Lizzie knew nothing about this and would only learn about it from a friend. For the sisters, it was outrageous that their penny-pinching father, who refused any and all requests for funds other than their $4 weekly allowance, had spent so much money to help out their stepmother's half-sister when he had never done anything like that for his own blood. As the situation became acrimonious, Andrew's solution was to try and pacify his daughters monetarily by giving them the deed of the old Borden homestead, which by that time was serving as a rental property. A property that was worth about $3,000, or exactly twice as much as the house he had acquired for Abby's stepsister, meaning he had effectively gifted Abby, Lizzie, and Emma property rights equal to $1,500 each. Not only that, but less than 3 weeks before the murders, Andrew purchased the property back from the sisters for $5,000, or $2,000 more than what it had been worth when he initially gifted it to them. With this in mind, it seems fair to wonder how long-lasting this issue actually was. For the prosecution and those who believe in Lizzie's guilt, this was the motive for the murders. It was this moment that sowed such division and acrimony within the family that it never healed. Lizzie, they insist, from that point on, permanently turned against her stepmother. Indeed, she reportedly stopped referring to Abby as mother following the purchase of her sister Sarah's home, instead only referring to her as Mrs. Borden from then on. Emma and Lizzie were reportedly in lockstep with this, oftentimes avoiding eating with their father and stepmother whenever possible. Most importantly, they contend there was a fear placed into Lizzie's heart that Abby was manipulating her father and positioning herself to get him to give her his entire estate when he died. Indeed, at one point in the investigation, the police would claim that Lizzie's friend Augusta Poole Tripp informed them that, quote,
Lizzie told me she thought her stepmother was deceitful, being one thing to her face and another to her back.
With Lizzie apparently believing that despite Abby's claim she had no influence over Andrew, the fact that she had managed to get him to buy the house for his stepsister suggested otherwise. According to the police, Augusta told them that Lizzie had told her that she feared that she and Emma might not get anything when their father died, implying that he would leave everything to Abby instead. Meanwhile, Lizzie and her supporters would contend that while yes, this had been an issue, it had happened 5 years before the murders, and it had been settled through the exchange of property and was now firmly in the past. And while yes, she had stopped calling Abby mother, the reality was Abby wasn't her mother, and Emma had notably never once called Abby mother, so it's not like this wasn't fairly normal in that household. It's also questionable how strong that particular bond/relationship ever was, what with Emma there seemingly also intent on serving as Lizzie's mother figure. Plus, Lizzie was an adult now, so I'm not really sure how big of a deal it really was for her to not call Abby mother anymore. Granted, it does not seem like this was common behavior by the standards of the day, but that does not necessarily translate to murderous hatred or confirm an ongoing suspicion of being cut off. Regardless, it would be the supposedly festering 5-year-old wound and the fears of manipulation that the police suspected led to Lizzie murdering her father and stepmother. Of course, that would not be the only reason why they suspected Lizzie Borden of being a murderer. However, the tale of the investigation and the case they look to build against Lizzie will be the primary focus of our next episode. Until then, though, this will have to remain a story for another time. Thank you for listening to Distorted History. If you would like to help out, please rate and review the podcast and tell your friends if you think they'll be interested. If you would like ad-free and early episodes, I've set up such a feed over at patreon.com/distortedhistory. By paying $10 a month, you will gain access to the special ad-free feed available on Spotify or likely through your podcast app as long as it uses an RSS feed. I will continue to post sources on Ko-fi and Twitter though, as it's just a convenient place to go to access that information. Regardless, once again, thank you for listening, and until next time.